Hey guys, if you need raw dog food anywhere in the United States, be sure to visit our friends over at texastripe.com. Another one. This time we got our dear brother, attorney Robert James out of Georgia. How you doing, sir?
I'm all right. How are you?
We're good. Hey man, so today we was gonna talk about dog bites, and I know you that's your thing there. Could we start out with you just giving an introduction of yourself and your background?
Sure. Well, I'm an attorney. I'm, in Georgia. Our main office, we have satellites all throughout the metro area. Our main office is in Atlanta, Georgia, downtown, actually. The name of our law firm is Robert James Trial Attorneys. My background or my entry into the law came through that of being a prosecutor. I was a prosecutor for 17 years. I was the elected district attorney in one of the local jurisdictions here, which is DeKalb County. If you're in the culture, hip, from hip hop, Decatur is in DeKalb County. And so everybody's heard of Decatur. And so, that city is in our county. We're the neighboring county to Atlanta. And so I was the elected DA there and, was a prosecutor for about 17 years. Prosecuted some cases involving dogs. One really, really bad case that, I can talk about a little bit later with a little girl. So, okay. Yes, so that's my background. Went into private practice around 2017. And just sort of fell into these cases, didn't necessarily target them, but the cases just sort of started coming to us. Started a lot in inner city communities in the African American and Latino communities where people have a lot of dogs, and sometimes they're feral, and sometimes they're not, but they're just not supervised or trained well, and you have a lot of dog attacks. And I remember as a kid, walking through the neighborhood, and you knew where the dogs were, and sometimes you just had to run, right?
Yeah, man.
Sometimes
it's a stigma with us. Us black folks, some are scared of dogs, bro.
Yeah.
Coming up, we had a lot of pit bull community, and a lot of guys like that aggression. So,
And people didn't necessarily supervise their dogs, and so you could just be walking down the street, you and some of your boys, and you knew when you walked by, Mr. So-and-so's house, if the dog saw you, you had to get it. So,
Yeah. Oh man, that brings back memories, because you remember just always walking down the street. It was somebody who had a mean dog, at least behind the fence.
Yep. And back then, people could keep dogs on chains, right? You can't do that anymore, at least not here in Georgia and Metro Atlanta. And, I believe that made the dog even meaner. And so if you happen to be walking by a day that somehow the dog had gotten off the chain, right, then that dog was going to oftentimes take that aggression out on you. And sometimes the dogs really weren't that mean. They just had a chase instinct. And when little boys saw them, they started running, and the dogs started chasing and hunting. So, old times. So that was the way things used to be. So,
yeah. So, born and raised in Georgia.
Well, I'm actually from Tennessee.
Oh, really?
I moved here in 1995, the end of 1990, December 27th, 1995. Looking to make it big in the big city. I'm from a small town in Tennessee, right outside of Nashville.
Oh, okay, nice. So, what inspired you to seek out being an attorney?
The ill treatment or the mistreatment of people in my community, my circle, and my family by people in power, right? Things happen in the neighborhood. Things happen in the hood, and there's, you just got to accept it, right? There's nothing anybody can do about it, and I'm talking about all the way from, corporations and companies and people that own real estate, treating tenants bad, putting them out, talking about police mistreating people. We've all seen that if you've walked through that life. I'm talking about crime being, certain conditions like crime and dilapidated living conditions being allowed to exist, and nobody does anything about it, and you just have to accept it. And I wanted to be in a position, through my education and my training, one day to be able to stand up and do something about the conditions that people in our communities, particularly in our communities that are poor, have to deal with every day. And that's not just one-sided. That's not just, well, the police sometimes mistreat our people, and so no, it's also, hey, there's crime in our community, and nobody cares as long as it stays in our community, right? So, my grandma can't walk to the store without looking over her shoulder, right? That's a problem, right? And I feel that, and that sort of links everything to quality of life, which includes, people controlling their animals, right? Because that's a quality of life issue. We started out with me laughing and joking about having to run from dogs, but the reality is that you shouldn't have to run, from dogs in your neighborhood, or just have to suffer attacks and say, well, that's just a part of life of living down here. So,
so you started to see these cases pick up in communities pretty often, huh?
Well, I've always seen people that were attacked or bitten by dogs, but when I grew up, that wasn't something that you called the people on for. It was just kind of what happened, right?
Right.
As you start to see a proliferation of what we would call in neighborhood, bad dogs, or what we call legally aggressive breeds, right? People started, really breeding and buying more aggressive breeds, because when I grew up, in the 80s, people didn't have pit bulls and Rotties and things of that. And they just had, mutts, right? Dog was mixed with everything. Dog, somebody's grandmama was feeding them out the back door, like that sort of thing. It was a neighborhood dog.
That's true.
By the time the late 80s and the 90s came, right, you started to see more pure breed dogs in the neighborhood, and a lot of them were aggressive breeds, right? And that's when you started to see more really bad attacks, right? I don't ever remember anybody being mauled to death or losing a limb or anything like that when I was a kid. But by the time I became a prosecutor in the 90s, we were seeing these cases, with these aggressive breed dogs were killing and mauling children, and sometimes people, but they were killing children. We had a little girl when I was in DeKalb County. I was an elected prosecutor there, as I said earlier, where, the dogs got out of their cage, and, she ended up losing an arm over this. The dogs just got her, and they got on her, and they just mauled her to the point where, she didn't have a limb. And so, these things started to happen more often. And people would purchase a lot of these aggressive breed dogs, and either they don't train them properly, right? Or they train them to be aggressive, right? They're not socialized properly, or the dogs would just kind of go stray and become feral. And then you would have these strains of pit bull that were stray dogs that had never been trained by anybody. And, we saw a lot of that in my community in DeKalb County, where you would have these kennels where people were raising pit bulls, or, fill in the blank. And, somehow the dogs some of them became stray, and they were just starting to breed with some of the quote unquote mutts,
right?
And then all of a sudden you got these aggressive dogs that don't belong to anybody, that are just running up and down the street. And so, so we started to see this, and that's when, things really shifted from my childhood to the way things are now. So,
yeah, I often wonder what made that change in our community, because this stuff, man, you just making me go back in my childhood. Remember that, we had mutts for dogs, and your pops be like, well, you have a dog because he's the one that alert you. He's outside. That's what he's for. You know what I mean? And then all of a sudden the Doberman the more aggressive breeds.
Yep.
Do you think it was movies, things like that, that made the culture change in dogs and how we wanted more aggressive dogs?
Yeah, some of it was movies, some of it was, culture change. Look, culture changed in the 80s in general, right? Because you have a proliferation of kind of crime, organized crime in the hood with with more drug dealers because of the crack epidemic, and everybody could be a drug dealer in the 80s, whereas in the 70s that wasn't so much the case, right?
Yeah.
And so you've got people with money and they can buy weapons, right? They can buy really, really nice cars, and they can buy, aggressive breed animals, which sort of fits everything. And it doesn't mean, stereotyping people. It doesn't mean everybody that loves an aggressive breed dog is that kind of person, because I've got family members who are responsible dog owners who have had, who've had pit bulls, who've had, German Rotties, American Rotties, who've had all these dogs, and they did a great job, and the dogs were great dogs, but when the dogs go in the hands of people who don't train them, or either train them to be aggressive, to guard a trap house or to guard them or something like that, then all of a sudden, that animal becomes a weapon and it's a problem. But you started to see that, really in the 80s, when you had this infusion of cash into the hood, because when I, as a very, very young man, like, there were only a handful of people who were basically doing dirt that had money in the hood. By the time I was a teenager, you had 15 and 16-year-olds that had more money than their parents, right? Yeah. And they were purchasing cars, guns, and dogs, right? Yeah. And they didn't want no Chihuahua, no poodle.
No, they I remember them boys had millions back in the early 90s, and they was young. They were young. Yeah.
Some of those were my friends growing up,
Right. Mine too. Sit right in next to class to them. You can't help who you know.
Yeah.
But you know the aspect of him as, that's just Billy. I'm sitting next to him today. You never knew he'll become what he became, but you still knew the dude used to make straight A's in school. He just chose a lifestyle that probably
he chose a lifestyle for a number of reasons, which is for a different podcast, I'm certain. But I grew up with those kids because I was born in the 70s, product of the 80s, college in the 90s, and so my formative years were in the 80s, and my friends. I saw the switch, and my friends started living that lifestyle, right around 14 or 15, which would have been for me the mid 80s, and so I lived that. That's not a movie for me. I saw the switch, and like I said, nice, fancy cars, weapons, and aggressive breed dogs all sort of came along with that. By the time you get to the 90s, you see the brother with the Timbs and the jean sagging with the pit bull on the chain that's pulling him behind, and you ain't see that in the 80s, right? That was the 90s, Yeah. And again, there's nothing wrong with having an aggressive breed dog if you're a responsible dog owner.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, because I like big dogs. I love them. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. You own dogs now?
I do not. I've got 4 kids, and they have been worrying me to death about getting one, and they're just old enough to kind of care for it. And so my wife and I decided that that's going to be our next, transition. Our lifestyle is busy, and they've been asking for one for a while, but I'm like, look, you got to learn how to, do this and that and the other around the house, because a dog is a responsibility, and it's going to be my dog, not yours.
Right. Right. Yeah. Well, brother, I know we can only talk from a perspective because laws are different in every, state, county, jurisdiction, or whatnot. But when it comes to your area, I know you mentioned that little girl being mauled, but could you talk about how crucial it is, or give the people examples of the repercussions of a dog bite financially, legally, and things of that nature?
Yeah. So you can be charged criminally first and foremost, right? If the negligence is bad enough, if you have a dangerous dog and and that dog attacks somebody, and that's what happened in the case when I was a prosecutor. A lady had some dangerous dogs, and I forget what breed they were, but they were aggressive breeds, and she had them outside in a cage that was flimsy that the dogs had gotten out of before. And this little girl was coming home from school, and the dogs, 3 of the dogs got out of the cage, and they just, it was terrible. I mean, it really was. They just went to work on her. She was young. She was about 10, 11 years old. And ultimately she, I remember visiting her in the hospital at, Eggleston here, our children's hospital. And she had, lost an arm, and that was the first, and that was a criminal prosecution. Up until that point, all of our prosecutions had been against dog owners who had neglected their animals, and had done bad things to them, and not against dog owners who had neglected their animals by not properly securing them. And so, that was the first prosecution I had seen. There was a lawsuit that followed that case. I didn't bring it, but another plaintiff's lawyer that I ultimately became friends with and worked some cases with, he brought the case, and I think he won like $16 million or something like that. I don't know if he ever collected, because ultimately, a lot of it is based on insurance, because, a lot of the folks that, have some of these animals, aren't independently, wealthy. You don't ride through Beverly Hills and see, a bunch of, big bad dogs. People are walking around with lap dogs and stuff like that,
Mm-hmm.
And it's not to say that we haven't brought cases against wealthy people in wealthy communities, because we have, but you just don't see as much of it. But no, there was a big verdict in that case. And that was sort of that was the beginning, because I got to know the family and I got to know the child, and I saw kind of firsthand, right, what not being a responsible dog owner can cost someone. Not just a person that ended up being jailed for it, but this child who's walking around, missing a limb for the rest of her life. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, even with the beware of dog signs, what does that mean to you as an attorney, and somebody still gets bit?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the beware of dog signs don't do what people think that they do, right? Folks in generally think that if they put up a sign or a warning, that kind of absolves them of any responsibility. You see it in other contexts when, you pull up in a parking lot and they say not responsible for things stolen or no returns. Just because you put it on the sign, it doesn't necessarily have the effect that you want it to have. And so ultimately, that does not preclude us from bringing a case. Now, it is evidence, right, in 2 ways. It's evidence that the person came onto the property and was aware, but that there was a dog here and that dog may be dangerous. However, that door swings both ways. When it swings the other way, it's evidence that you knew your dog was dangerous, right? And so you can't say I didn't know, I didn't know Bebo was a bad dog. He's just a good little puppy, right? When you got this beware dog sign out here, because you don't warn people of a danger that does not exist, right, or that you're not aware of.
Mm-hmm.
And so we, even though we have to deal with those, right, in terms of knowledge, but that also is important, because we use those against dog owners, showing that they have knowledge, which quite frankly can be an end game if you're the dog owner, in certain states like Georgia. If you have knowledge that your dog is a bad dog and your dog is improperly secured, then, it's in game.
Dang. So the repercussions, just say say most families, we middle class, a lot of people struggling right now as it is financially with the situation that's going on financially within our country. Things are high. Regular family, 150,000 down revenue. What's at stake for them if they get a dog out, go up and maybe just bite the little girl up the street? And how do you go about going after them? I'll say it that way.
Sure. Well, the first thing I look is to see whether or not, there's potentially any liability, right? And so I want to know, first of all, was that dog properly secured, right? Because if the dog's not properly secured, then, under Georgia law, it's going to be presumed to be a dangerous animal if it's at large, if it's not properly secured. And so if that dog's not on the leash, if that dog is not enclosed, in a fence, and that dog is what we call at large in a lot of places here, then, you're in trouble. it really makes our case a lot easier. If the dog was not necessarily off the leash, or if the dog was, say, in a home, because I have a case where a child was attacked by a dog, but that dog was inside of a home. The next question I want to ask is, did the dog owner know that this dog was, vicious or aggressive, right? And if so, was the dog owner handling the dog in a way that will prevent the dog from biting other people? Was the dog owner negligent in a way that he or she handled the dog? Should they have done more to prevent the dog from biting or attacking somebody? And so those are all questions that I'm looking at when I'm trying to determine, liability. There's even liability through a statute in Georgia, or through common law, where it talks about, and I'm going to use a fancy word, then I'm going to a fancy phrase, and I'm going to break it down. It's called, negligent performance of a voluntary undertaking, right? Okay. And all that means is that if I voluntarily do something, right, and you rely on it, right, and I perform that voluntary duty negligently, and you get hurt, then even though I didn't have to do it in the first place, I am liable, And so I had a case one time where, a lady was a realtor, and she was going around looking at homes. And there was a woman who owned a dog there, was a big shepherd, and the dog was being aggressive and was on the leash and in the house. And she told my client, well, don't worry about it. Right? I got the dog. He's not aggressive. He's just excited. Come on in. I got the dog. Well, she assured the woman that she had the dog. Dog's on the leash. Dog's in the house. Dog's not at large. Dog had no history of ever biting anybody before, right? Or being aggressive with anybody before. However, she assured my client that she had control of the dog. And so she voluntarily did that and told her to come in. My client went in the door. And as soon as my client gets in the door, that shepherd pounced and, and basically, used its paws and its upper body to wrestle my client to the ground, to basically body slam or tore a rotator cuff and then bit her in the leg.
Yeah.
So, the insurance company and the defense tried to say, well, the dog's not been aggressive before. My dog owner didn't know the dog was on the leash. And so there's no proof of negligence here, basically. And, and I'll talk about the one bite rule in a minute. Basically, we should be shielded by the one bite rule or modified one bite rule. And I'm like, no, not so fast. My client would not have gone in that house had they not been assured by you that you had control of your animal. Right. Right. Mm-hmm. And when that dog got out of your control and attacked my client, that's your fault. And so we settled the case for, pretty decent money, 6-figure settlement, because the lady had to have surgery, on her right rotator cuff.
Right. So as far as the financial payout, is that something that's directly targeted to the individual at fault, or their home insurance or something like that?
It can be both, right? The first thing we're looking for is homeowners insurance, right? Because that money's there, and that money's there every time. And you're going to deal, when you sue people, you're going to primarily deal with insurance if it's a premises case or a case involving a house, right? However, if I have a millionaire, okay, and that millionaire has a home that's underinsured, or is at their second home, and there's only, say, $400,000 worth of insurance, okay, and I just settled a case like this, where there was only $400,000 worth of insurance. Well, there was a German Shepherd that had gotten off the leash out of its enclosure and didn't bite my client, but my client was an elderly woman, and the German Shepherd basically went and tackled the lady, and then when she tried to get back up, he basically grabbed her and body slammed her on the ground, where she broke her hip, right? She broke her hip, and she also had to have a steel rod placed in her arm, and she was in a nursing home, a rehab facility for several months, right? And had to learn how to walk again, and 75, 76 years old, well, we settled that case for, just shy of $1 million, right? Well, there was only $400,000 worth of insurance. So in a case like that, the first thing we do is look to see what, if any, assets the person has, right? If I know I'm going to have more injuries than I have insurance, I'm always looking at personal assets. And so we'll run a background check, and we'll run certain checks, asset checks, to see what you own and what kind of assets you have, and are you wealthy? Because if you do have money and you're underinsured, then I'm not going to stop with the insurance. I'm going to want some of your money as well.
Ooh, ooh, boy, y'all, you get these dogs trained and under control, boy.
It's a lot cheaper. Obedience school is a whole lot cheaper than having to deal with me. You know, because like I promise you, it is.
Yeah. Has there ever been a case where you had to maybe get some testimony or bring a trainer in for something? Maybe a dog that was trained that maybe had an incident.
So when we file a lawsuit, we send what's called interrogatories and requests for production of documents. Interrogatories are questions, and those questions ask about training and obedience school. And if there was a trainer, we want to know that trainer's name, right? You know, we want the phone number, the contact information. If there's paperwork from any certifications or whatever, we want all of that. We want all of that information. And so, yeah, in cases like that, you know, we would, number one, want to know anybody that's trained or handled or dealt with the dog. We're going to talk to all of the neighbors, all the people around, to see if anybody's had any issue with the dog. We'll send the PI out to question all the neighbors. And then we're going to do open records requests with, you know, in the city and the county where the dog has actually been living and has been housed, because we want to know if there's been any complaints to animal control that they've had to come out about that animal or about that dog owner before. And if we go to trial, we're also more than likely going to bring an outside expert that talks about handling and training a dog, so they can explain to a jury that, no, that's not the way you do it. This is the way you do it.
Gotcha. Whoa. Some of this I didn't know that you would have to go in like a PI to ask your neighbors. Whew.
Oh yeah.
So
we want to talk to all the neighbors, because sometimes you'll have a dog. It's that 80s mentality, right? This dog has been running around scaring everybody. Mm-hmm. Folks know that Miss Mary's got a bad dog down the street, but nobody's called animal control, right? They just kind of ignore it and avoid Miss Mary's dog. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so if Miss Mary's dog bites my client or mauls my client or throws my client down in the street, and I send an open records request or freedom of information request to animal control, it looks like the dog has been a good dog and it was just a one-time incident. And so it's difficult for me to prove that Miss Mary was negligent in the way that she managed her dog, right?
Right.
However, if the neighbors are like, nah, you know, like that's a bad dog. That dog chases my children out of the yard. Then everybody my PI talks to that says that is going to get a subpoena and is going to be deposed, going to have to be subject to deposition. And that's evidence.
Okay. So how extensive does it have to get? Because most of the stuff the scenarios you gave, serious injuries.
Yeah.
What if it's just a, 60-pound dog might have been an adult, your neighbor or something? How usually does that go? Do people prosecute for that type of stuff normally?
Absolutely. It all depends on. So our cases are driven by damages, right?
Damages, okay.
And you can be attacked by a big dog, right? And the dog has some restraint and it just be a nip. In which case, I'm not really that interested in fooling with the case, because we're going to spend a lot of time and energy, and you've got $3,000-4,000 in medical bills, which means your recovery is going to be maybe $10,000 or something like that, split between me and you. I'm hustling backwards, right? I'm not doing that,
right.
But you could have a little dog, and I have a case like this that we just settled for about $100,000 probably a couple of months ago, where a little ankle dog came out and bit my client, but didn't have restraint, and really kind of got teeth into my client. My client ended up having, around her ankle, my client ended up having nerve damage, and I think, as a matter of fact, the settlement was for $250,000. It was max policy limit, and it would have been more, but they didn't have any more. That was all the insurance they had, and the individual wasn't independently wealthy, and there was no reason going after them because there was nothing to get. Right? You sue somebody with no money, you're not going to get anything. So we settled the case for $250,000. But that case was worth a lot of money, even though it was a little bitty dog, because that dog, bit into my client and gave my client permanent nerve damage in her leg. And so recovery is driven by damages. We have cases sometimes where the nerve damage, isn't permanent, or we don't have any nerve damage at all, but we have permanent scars,
Mhm.
right? And so on cases in particular where you'll see like young children or young ladies that are bitten, on their thigh or their ankle or their calf area, and they've got a bad permanent scar that's going to be on the back of their leg for the rest of their life, both from the bite and the surgery that they may have had to have. Well, that's going to be worth significant money, because now I've got a young woman that for the rest of her life, every time she wears, a short dress or a short skirt, she's, her and the rest of the world are going to be reminded of what happened to her.
Mhm. I'm not trying to put you out of business, but this channel is full of breeders, full of people who looking for dogs and learning how to buy dogs, what to look for, trainers, protection dog
Yeah.
trainers. And like I said, I'm not trying to put you out of business, but what steps can we take not to see you?
Yeah. Be responsible, man. I don't like, if you're responsible, be responsible. That starts with proper socialization of your animal,
Mhm.
right? If you have a dog, right, and that dog isn't properly socialized, and y'all know what I mean, right? You get the dog and you train it to be a bad dog, right? Or that dog isn't around other people. And even if it's a lap dog or a pet, that dog's not around other people. And then all of a sudden, you got the dog out playing in the front yard with you, and you're wondering why they're aggressive, be responsible, train the dog, socialize the dog if you have it, same way you would be with the child, right? You don't have a child, and not educate and socialize and train that child to be to be a safe person, a responsible adult. Same way with an animal. The other thing is, make sure your dog is on the leash. There are leash laws, right? If you violate the leash law, you're gonna have to see me, and you're not gonna have much of a defense, And if your dog isn't on the leash, make sure your dog is in a proper enclosure. And I stress proper enclosure. The case where I got near $1 million on, the dog wasn't in a proper enclosure. It was in an enclosure, but the enclosure wasn't proper, and the dog got out of it. And dogs are master escape artists, And so if that enclosure, if you haven't spent money, to make sure that your enclosure is secure, the dog's going to get out. And when the dog attacks somebody, you're going to be liable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Hey, well, that's about all I got. You covered a lot in a short amount of time, man. But for the people who want to get in touch with you, could you tell them how to get in touch with you?
Sure. Our web address is attorneyrobertjames.com. Mm-hmm. That's attorneyrobertjames.com. And then phone number is 404-891-0977.
Any more closing remarks or benediction?
I would just say, use common sense and be responsible. If you're going to have an aggressive breed dog, understand that animals are unpredictable, and no matter how well trained that animal is, something could happen, to make that dog, flip or snap. But ultimately, you can limit the possibility of coming to see someone like me, and more importantly, of your animal permanently injuring or worse, killing somebody, if you're just responsible and you train that dog and you properly socialize that dog.
Okay, gotcha. Well, counsel, we sure do appreciate you coming, taking your time out your day to have this chat with me. I really appreciate it.
Hey, I appreciate you having me on, and I've enjoyed my time with you. Okay.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, guys. We'll see you guys the next time. All right.
Thanks.
Hold on a second, counsel.